Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you could make it to today's webinars, School Telepractice Assessment Part 1. Really excited to have a very distinguished guest, Erin Elizabeth Lundblom. And she's from the University of Pittsburgh. But we're also joined by next week's presenter, Ellen Kahn. She's going to be in the background. But we're going to learn a lot of really cool things about telepractice assessment, specifically as it applies to the legal requirements that you all have to abide by. But let's talk a little bit about the agenda for today's webinar. I'm just going to walk you through what we got here. Obviously, we've got a brief introduction. We're going to tell you, who we are. My name's George Dayton. I work with Illuma, and I'll introduce our company and Erin, but then we'll turn over the bulk of the time to the presentation, and then we'll wrap up with the Q&A. So one of the things I want to remind everyone of is as we get into the presentation, we've got a chat functionality here, and I want to invite all of you to write your questions in the chat as they come to mind, and please know that we will come back to these questions. Anyway, moving on, this webinar is brought to you by Illuma. That's who I work for. I'm the director of marketing. And we are a teletherapy provider for K-12. We specifically provide speech, OT, PT, mental health, counseling, assessment, all kinds of support to K-12 schools all across the country. We've been around for 10 years. We're celebrating our 10-year anniversary. And to date, we've served over 27,000 students. If you like this webinar, if you like what we're doing, follow us on Twitter. We're going to be doing a lot of this kind of stuff. But also wanted to mention to you that this webinar is part of a series, Online Therapy from Research to Practice. And we've had some great speakers already. A couple weeks ago, we had Sue Grogan-Johnson. We had William Bolden last week. As I mentioned, we have Erin Elizabeth Gill Lundblom this week, Ellen Kahn next week, Jonine Lohman, and also K. Todd Houston. This is literally a who's who of telepractice outcome research. These are some of the biggest pioneers in this field and the people that are really responsible with moving so much forward. So again, we invite you to if you've missed any of these past webinars, make sure you go get them. You can get them through the website, and definitely stay tuned for these upcoming webinars. But let's jump into our presenter, Erin Elizabeth Lundblom. She's a professor at the University of Pittsburgh, where she obviously teaches all things speech-language pathology. She's also the clinical coordinator. And again, just a really great expert. It's such a privilege to have her, and you can kind of see what her areas of interest encompass. But let's talk a little bit about today's presentation. In fact, do you want to give us a little bit of a precursor of what people are going to see today?
Sure. Thanks, George. It's nice to be with everybody today, and I appreciate your time and your ears to listen and hopefully watch a little bit of the slides. So one of the conversations that Ellen and I have had over the years is really the need to develop some sort of tool to consider teletherapy in school-based settings. And that's what I'll present today. And then Ellen will follow up next week talking about this tool that we've created to really start thinking about some considerations for best practice in teleservices in school-based settings. And I will jump in today with sort of the educational legal background of this tool and preview the tool, as well as sort of explain how we developed it in a sense, really with the underpinnings in educational legislation and regulations. All right, so I'll sort of just jump in and get started. That what we've called our tool is the School Telepractice Assessment. And I'm actually going to put a link to it in the chat for anyone listening, but it's also coming up in a couple slides. If you're interested in looking at it, which I would suggest actually during this presentation, follow that link and you'll see that there's an option to download a document, and it will open as a Word document. And what it captures is this tool that Ellen and I are going to talk about this week, as well as next week. Let me make sure my slides are working now. I'm going to sort of keep going to make sure we have time and get that link up. So this is a free access tool that we've placed online for anyone to use at this point, especially in the interest of really making sure that best practice is happening in school-based settings in relation to any service, but also telepractice. So a little bit about the tool. I'm going to preview a couple slides, but this is all captured in the link in the document that I've referenced. I'm going to focus today on a couple pieces of the tool that we've created. And most of the areas that I'm going to focus on is tied to educational law and regulations and the considerations that have to be made when providing services. And we're going to focus on speech-language pathology services in school-based settings. So what I really want to focus on today then is how we got to this point of creating the STA, right? And the background that really helped to create it. So federal legislation and associated regulations set the requirements for special education, which state that education agencies, right, or state education agencies or local education agencies or our schools have to meet or exceed the law to receive federal funding. And we don't need to go into a history, but the first disability law related to school-based settings was enacted in 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. And that was intended to help children with disabilities have a right to education. EHA later became the federal statute IDEA in 1990, which was amended in 97 and reauthorized in 2004. And that's going to be the majority of the presentation that I share today, is really focused on IDEA and how our tool really helps look at teleservices in a school-based setting to make sure they're aligned with the requirements of IDEA. But I do want to note that there's two other pieces of legislation that also impact persons with disabilities in school settings: the American with Disabilities Act, as well as Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And speech-language pathologists might find themselves working with children receiving services under Section 504 too. So it's important to keep that consideration in mind. Right. So a little bit about each one of these education legislations. So IDEA, which was last reauthorized in 2004, is an act that provides federal finances to our SEAs, state education agencies, and LEAs, local education agencies, to guarantee special education and related services for eligible children with disabilities. And we're going to dive into what does IDEA say, but a lot of IDEA focuses on that public schools have to provide every student with an eligible disability, FAPE, or a free and appropriate public education that's designed to provide meaningful benefit through an individualized education program in the least restrictive environment. Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was enacted in 1990, is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination based solely on disability. And this is wide ranging, so employment, public services, but what it does for a school-based settings is requires public schools to provide without charge aids and services to ensure that students with disabilities have equal opportunity to participate, right? And there's special consideration given to parent preferences as well. Now, the last law that's important to consider is Section 504. Right, of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which is also a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination based on disability in programs and activities, public and private, that receive federal assistance. So this also impacts the school-based setting. It requires public schools to meet the needs of students with disabilities through educational services as adequately, and this is the important piece, as adequately as the needs of students with disabilities. So if we're trying to sort of lay this landscape, right, of these different laws and how they all fit together, this is sort of the way that I conceptualize it. We have all of our students in general education, right, that are getting meaningful education in their school-based setting. Right. Then we have within that group, a group of students that have impairments. Now, within the group of students that have impairments, we have some that will get services or aids under the auspices of ADA or Section 504. But a smaller subset of those students will get services through IDEA because they've met the eligibility requirements for IDEA to receive special education services. So what we did with the STA is try to tackle on a big picture level, right? Acknowledging services and rights of students through the Americans with Disabilities Act, as well as Section 504, as well as IDEA. So if you've had time to access that document, you'll be able to read through the questions that are very much grounded in education legislation and important considerations for services that are provided in school-based settings. What I want to spend the majority of our time, though, today talking about is really the part of the STA that ties to IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Much easier to say IDEA or IDEA, as a lot of people refer to it. So IDEA is a law that ensures services for disabilities, for children with disabilities throughout the nation. It governs how states and public agencies provide early intervention, special education, and related services to over 6.5 million eligible infants, toddlers, children, and youth with disability. I think it's important to pull back and look at the exact wording that's included in IDEA. Right? That disability is a part of the human experience and in no way diminishes the right of individuals to participate or contribute in society. And improving the educational results for children with disabilities is an essential element of our national policy of ensuring equality of opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency. There's a lot of really important concepts buried in just that introduction to disability. IDEA further goes on to really put forth some aspirational statements where it states that the goal or the purpose is to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free and appropriate public education, which is designed to meet their needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. And within the wording of IDEA, right, the text, there's a lot of different tenets, right, that come to light. And this is one of the first ones, FAPE, a free and appropriate education. And we'll delve into some of the other components or tenets that are included in IDEA. Just as sort of a background, and I know most of you probably know this already, but there are 4 sections to IDEA. Part 1 includes the justification for IDEA and the terminology, whereas Part B specifies services for children 3 to 21. So these are going to be your children that are receiving evaluations or treatment services in school-based settings. Whereas Part C of IDEA guarantees services for infants and toddlers. So this is our birth to 3 legislation, where services may include family training, counseling, home visits, speech-language services are here as well, including as well as occupational and physical therapy. Part D of IDEA covers research and personnel preparation, as well as professional development. So a little bit about those core principles of IDEA, because they are very important when we start to look at implementation of IDEA, as well as in our development of the STA. That within IDEA, there's a number of core principles. There is zero reject, which is all states have to establish what many states call a child find system, where states are responsible to identify, locate, and evaluate all students suspected of having a disability. And this is from birth to age 21. That also within IDEA, there is verbiage about conducting an appropriate evaluation. And we're going to dive into appropriate evaluations in relation to speech language services a bit more today. Right. Another core principle that I already referenced is that FAPE, free and appropriate education, that all students with disabilities that are eligible under IDEA must receive a free and appropriate public education. Another core principle is LRE, or least restrictive environment, which mandates that a child with special education needs must receive services within the general education classroom to the greatest degree possible, right? And that removal from the general education classroom is only allowed if those supplemental aids and services are not sufficient in the general education classroom. But other opportunities then to interact with peers without disabilities must be provided. One thing to consider about LRE is that it's a continuum of services, right? It means that services may be outside of the classroom, but may also be inside the classroom, and that should change based on the child's best interests. A big consideration of IDEA, which was a large emphasis in the reauthorization in 2004, is parent participation, that we should involve parents as much as possible and provide them with sufficient information in a timely manner so they can fully be knowledgeable and participate in educational decisions for their child. Related to parent participation is the term procedural safeguards, right? And procedural safeguards, there's a long list of sort of what they are, but it's the safeguards that are included in IDEA to make sure that us as providers and SEAs and LEAs, right, comply with the procedural requirements of IDEA. And this could include giving informed consent, making sure that there's opportunities for parent participation, confidentiality, as well as other procedures related to what happens when there's a resolution or you have to move to mediation. So IDEA has a number of core principles that are embedded throughout it. And one thing that we tried to do in the STA is capture these. So for example, if you're looking at that document right now and you go to question 5, you'll see there's a whole series of consideration that is just looking at how to consider least restrictive environment, which is a really important consideration considering telehealth services as how do we make sure, right, that we've considered different options for services and this child is still getting opportunities to participate with non-disabled peers in other potential avenues within that school-based setting, right? So as I mentioned, I want to come back to a little bit more depth in the area of assessment and a comprehensive assessment. But before we sort of move there and talk about assessment and eligibility, I just want to share what is identified under IDEA. There are 14 different categories of eligibility. So for a student to be receiving special education services, it means that they have been identified under one of these 14 different categories. Now, all of us speech-language pathologists can clearly see that we are a separate category, speech and language impairment. One thing that is important to note, though, with IDEA, especially in relation to our services, is that not only will we be a primary service provider for those students that under IDEA, right, are diagnosed as having a speech or language impairment, but we may also be a related service provider for a number of these different areas that are listed under the 14 categories. But also, I think this slide is a nice glimpse at looking at the numbers, right? 16% of children receiving special education services were identified as speech or language impaired. But if we look across some of the other categories, we definitely might also be providing related services in speech and language to children that have been identified as having a TBI, multiple disabilities, could be hearing impairment, as well as autism. So we're going to be a big service provider in school-based settings, providing our speech and language services, which then is important to consider. What do we do in our school-based settings, right? We can identify that we're one of the 14 federal categories of disabilities under IDEA, right? And we all know that a speech and language impairment indicates that there's a communication disorder that is adversely affecting a child, but this is a big difference in school-based settings. It has to impact educational performance. And we're going to talk about that for eligibility, as well as completing a comprehensive assessment. That for a speech and language impairment in a school-based setting, for a child to receive services, we have to show that that impairment has an adverse effect on education. Another thing to consider when we're starting to think about our services in school-based settings is IDEA eligibility. So again, I'm going to sort of talk in the sense of we're looking at students to diagnose a speech and language disability as the primary impairment category under IDEA. And there's a series of considerations that have to be made for eligibility under IDEA. First, does the child have one of the 14 specified disabilities? Second, does the disability have an adverse educational effect? So there's that adverse educational effect coming in again. And does the child need specially designed instruction and related services? If the answer is yes to all of these questions, then a child is eligible for services under IDEA, which sounds really simple, but we want to break down more of the assessment process next. So if you look at the STA, it very much guides you through the eligibility process, right? So it's a great tool to use to think about eligibility under IDEA. But let's delve into that evaluation process in IDEA, right? That through that eligibility process, which is more captured on the right side of this slide, that if we're trying to determine eligibility, we need to first look at what is the existing data that we have, and then we determine what data do we need, right? And that leads us then towards an eligibility determination that we might document that we have a speech or language impairment. And then we go back to that previous slide where then we're considering what is the educational impact of this speech or language impairment, and does it need specialized instruction or specially designed instruction. So what I'm going to focus on now for a little bit is what is the determination of needed data. So this is our assessment evaluation process, right? And what should we do? So an evaluation needs to be comprehensive. So it needs to include qualitative data sources, and this could be from educators, parents, other service providers, and it should also include multiple measures and methods, which could include dynamic assessments, norm reference standardized tools, criterion reference assessments, developmental profiles. All of that has to be captured in our assessment process. Our goal being to determine if the student's communication disorder, if there is a disorder present, as well as is it adversely affecting academic achievement or function in that school setting, which then leads us to where we'll wrap up today is determining goals for intervention based on the communication disorder and its adverse effect in a school-based setting. Right. So what should we be doing as part of our evaluation? Well, we want to aim for a comprehensive evaluation, and that requires us using a range of valid methods and assessment tools, depending on what disorder we're suspecting, right? So it's hard to talk to all of our different disorder areas, but I can talk rather generally that we want to use a variety of assessment tools and strategies to help us gather functional information, right? And information, academic information. So some really important takeaways in IDEA are that SLPs cannot use any single measure or assessment as the sole criterion for determining eligibility. We have to use hard data. So that could be from our norm reference standardized tests, as well as our soft data. So that could be from classroom probes, curriculum tests, observations, parent information, dynamic assessments, even the classroom portfolio, right? And this collectively helps us to decide, is there a disorder present? And then we move back to that process of considering educational impact. So what I often think of in my head for these comprehensive evaluations is basically different buckets of information that I'm going to collect. And this helps to ensure that I'm comprehensive in my evaluation methods, right? And I'm looking at definitely areas that would have an impact on educational performance, because go back to IDEA, that's what we have to show, that there's a disorder present and it negatively or adversely impacts educational performance. So a way to approach a comprehensive evaluation is to think about the different pieces of data, right, that we can collect. So we can use our decontextualized tests. So those would be our norm referenced SLP measures. So our SELF-5 or our PLS, right? But beyond just using that, remember, we can't use any sole measure, we also want to look at other sources of information. So this could be looking at contextualized tests, which could be your state or local tests. It could be the tests that the teacher uses within the curriculum, right? As well as any measures of achievement that are used in the school-based setting. Moving past sort of testing, this is where we can get more authentic type of information that is more contextualized to the school-based setting, which really helps capture more of what is the adverse educational impact. So we can look at academic activities. So if possible, we might be able to conduct an observation, or one of my favorite tools is to conduct an artifact analysis, right? And an artifact analysis is looking at the work from a classroom and looking at it from a lens of what is the impact of potentially a child's language system or literacy system on their performance in the classroom, right? Could also be looking at curriculum assessments or educational records. And then the last box that I left here are a lot of our authentic tools that we're all familiar with, right? That as part of a comprehensive assessment, we want to consider including that test, teach, retest model of dynamic assessment. We might want to gather samples, whether it's a narrative sample, either oral or written, right? And especially with our older school age kids, we want to make sure that we're including those written narratives, as well as our language or speech samples for potentially some of our younger kids. One of the tools that I like to use frequently for a comprehensive evaluation is interviewing the child or the student, right? And really asking them some questions about what is the impact, right, in your classroom of maybe some of their challenges that they're having, whether it's with reading or writing, right? And that can be part then of your authentic information to help sort of capture that educational impact. Now, I'm not going to delve too much into the process, right, the timeline of special education. Know that that is a state by state, and sometimes it's a district by district sort of process as to how many days you have, okay? But it's really important to know that from the start to understand how to plan and implement a comprehensive assessment, right? So where does this take us back to? Well, it takes us back to really considering this determination of eligibility, that we look at what data existed and then we complete our comprehensive assessment and collect all of those different buckets of information. And now we're ready to go, okay, is there a speech or language impairment present? And then we move sort of to the next step of this process then of we have to look to see, does it have an adverse educational effect or impact, right? And for educational impact, it's important to consider that it's not just academic, right? We can collect data and support educational impact from academic, social, or vocational areas. So for example, academic impact, we could note that a child has difficulty comprehending directions in a classroom, right? They have difficulty with word decoding or reading comprehension or math, right? Math has a lot of language in it that it could be the, simple math facts are fine, but when we get to the word problems, we start to see those decoding and comprehension issues arise. It could be grammar and language arts. It could be difficulty even in art or PE with any language-based directions that are given. Right. But what we're trying to capture is, yes, we have a speech or language impairment, and I can show that there is direct academic impact from that speech or language impairment. Right. Now, as I said, though, it's not just academic impact. We can also support social impact, right? That this speech or language disorder has a social impact on this student in a school-based setting. And that could be that their communication interferes with developing relationships with peers, right? It could be that they don't initiate or they terminate interactions with others because of their communication status. It could be that they are teased, right, by others about their communication. Or it could be that they are very quiet and reserved and almost withdrawn because of embarrassment or frustration due to communication challenges. So all of those areas can be documented too to really capture that, yes, there is a social impact of this speech or language disorder that is impacting educational relevance, right? And the last area that we should consider for educational impact or educational relevance is the more long-term picture that IDEA puts out from even the description of purpose, right? That we're looking at, can this person be independent and be employable in a vocation? So we might have impact that we say, yeah, this child has a hard time understanding directions. So it would be a definite impact if we're looking at vocation. Or maybe this child has inappropriate responses to others' comments, which would impact sort of that social situation in a work setting. So there's lots of different ways that we can document educational relevance, and that's important to consider as part of sort of our eligibility process, right? That beyond just identifying, does the child have one of the 14 specialized or specified disabilities, such as speech or language, we also want to then take to the next bubble and go, what is the adverse educational effect, right? And that can be academic, that can be social, or that can be vocational. But part of our role is to document that there is an academic impact for that child based on their speech or language disorder. And that really leads us then to the next bubble of, if we can say yes to bubbles 1 and bubble 2, right? Then we're considering, does the child need specially designed instruction and related services, right? And that's where we lead to the term special education. Right? What is special education? Well, special education is specially designed instruction, right? At no cost to meet the needs of the child. It can be adaptation of content, it could be the methodology of instruction, but it's designed so that that child can meet the needs of the general education curriculum, right? Just like any other child. So this sort of takes us back to that idea of a free and appropriate public education, right? So let's delve in, actually, before I delve into a little bit more about SDI, in the STA, there's a whole series of questions that guide you through considering specially designed instruction based on what the needs of the child are, the characteristics of the general education classroom, as well as thinking about what additional aids or services are needed. So that's captured in question 6. But to sort of give a little bit of background that helped us develop this tool, right? When we were considering specially designed instruction, it's a really broad term, right? So it's really thinking about what the teacher potentially in a classroom does, or we can go with us, the SLP, does to instruct or assess or reteach, or how do we adapt the content or the instructional methodology or just the delivery of instruction. So specially designed instruction is really far-reaching. It can include pre-teaching. It can include reteaching concepts and vocabulary, which we're all going, yes, we've done that, right? Modeling, guided practice, repetition, or using multisensory types of strategies. Even just what we do with our prompts and cueing, that scaffolded type of instruction or service, is what is considered specially designed instruction. Right. Another important consideration that comes into play for specially designed instruction, which is often abbreviated SDI, a lot easier to say, is accommodations and modifications. Right. And I threw this up here just to make it clear, because I often get asked, what's the difference? Right. Accommodations change how a student learns. Right. A modification changes what a student is taught or expected to learn. Right. So accommodations could be, using a highlighter to highlight those vocabulary words, whereas a modification could be a reduction in the amount of vocabulary words that a child is expected to be assessed on weekly in the classroom. Right. Another area that falls under SDI is what is considered supplemental aids and services, or SES. Right, IDEA is filled with lots of abbreviations. But for SAS, it's what does the student need in order to advance, right, towards meeting their goals and advance towards making progress in the general education curriculum. So this could, again, pull back to some of the examples of what we use, graphic organizers, prompting, cueing, but it can also include things like extended time, having somebody scribe or write for the student, manipulatives, for example, in math, seating requests, or just even different types of paper that might be used in a school setting. Um, Also included under this umbrella of SDI is related services. So these might be services that are required to help a child with a disability benefit from special education. And there's a long list of examples of related services that might include medical support or support from other school personnel, transportation. This is where OT and PT fall in as well. But if you see the very first line, this is also where speech and language services fall. So this is sort of tying back to where I started today, that when we look at the eligibility categories under IDEA, yes, speech and language is its own eligibility category, but we might also be providing services that are related services to students that have a TBI or autism, and we might be falling under more of the related service umbrella. Right. So it's important to keep in mind that our services might be in special education, right? That SDI, or we might be part of the related service. And this depends on what the primary disability is for that student, right? Related services to receive related services, keep in mind though that a student would have to be eligible for SDI in special education and need speech and language services to benefit from special education. Okay. All right, so I think I'm on track so far, so that's good. So moving along from looking at eligibility, right, and considering what is a comprehensive assessment, if we check all of those boxes, right, that we've completed a comprehensive assessment, that we can show that there is a disorder, that there's an educational impact that adversely impacts the child, and that the child needs SDI or special education services, that leads us to then an individualized education program, or what most people will refer to as the IEP. So I want to start at sort of the forest level of the IEP. What is the goal of it, right? It's to establish measurable goals for a child. It's also to document what are the special education and related services and aids that the school will provide, or the public agency. So we go back to the LEA, right, on behalf of that child. And it really looks at three main areas, right? What will the school provide within the general education curriculum, for extracurricular activities, as well as non-academic activities, right? And that is sort of the forest level view of what is the goal of an IEP, right? So one important consideration that, as I mentioned earlier, was very much emphasized within the reauthorization of IDEA in 2004 was inclusion of the child as appropriate, as well as the parents, and making sure that we are listening, right, and including their viewpoints and preferences in relation to education. But part of this comes then into there's going to be a team of individuals that are working together on behalf of this student. That has to include one regular ed teacher, one special ed teacher. It has to include a rep from the local education agency. In some cases, you might need somebody that is going to interpret results. Could be other people with expertise, or it could be other agencies in the community that are helping with transition types of services. What's important to consider, and part of the reason I included this slide, was this requires collaboration, right? That all of these parties have to work together. And we captured that in the STA as well, right? That part of the foundation of IDEA is this sense of working together for the best interests of the student, so that they have a free and a FAPE within the least restrictive environment. So there's a number of questions that are captured within our tool that really help you consider, is collaboration optimal? Are the parents or guardians included, right? Who else is included? Right? There has to be a regular education teacher as well as special education teacher. So it really helps guide you through, okay, who should I be working with when I'm considering providing services for a student on an IEP? Which then gets us into like a lot of the IEP components. And there are many components to an IEP. And these are all laid out within IDEA, that an IEP has to include present levels, annual goals, measuring progress, special education, related services, supplemental aids and services, extent of non-participation, accommodations for assessment, service delivery, and transition. And I put the bullets on the left and the actual wording from IDEA on the right, but all of these components have to be included within the IEP. Now, every state, every district has different formats and different tools that they use, but it's important to just sort of, again, at the forest level, consider that all IEPs have to address present level. How is the child currently doing in school? How does the disability affect his or her performance? Right? That present level statement has to be there. There also has to then be identified annual goals, right? That the team develops that are appropriate for those student needs as based on that present level of performance and functioning, right? The IEP also then has to include a description of how progress is going to be measured towards those goals, as well as touch on some of the topics that we've talked through today related to related services. What else does the child need to be successful in the school? Are there any supplemental aids or services that the child may need? So again, this is where we might be listed as a supplemental or as a related service in this section. We also want to know, when is the child not in the general education classroom? So that's extent of non-participation, where we have to calculate how much time will the child participate outside of the general education setting, and when will they be with their non-disabled peers, right? Also, then we want to consider, for testing purposes, are there any accommodations that the students need? And then probably a really important one to consider is, how are services going to be provided? Where, how often, how long, right? All of these sort of details that are important to building the IEP. Okay. So this takes us to a really important point that ties back to comprehensive assessments and eligibility, that our goal is to document that there is an adverse educational impact, and we have to capture that then in our present level of academic and functional performance, or the PLAAFP. And this is where we identify what are the strengths of the student, but also what are the critical needs of the student in relation to that general education curriculum, right? How is their language impairment impacting reading, math, social studies, right? Or how are their struggles with decoding and spelling impacting language arts curriculum? Right? This is where we have to very clearly capture this present level, because it's going to drive the rest of the IEP document, right? It is essentially the driving force for the IEP document. Things that we want to consider including in here is really focus on what is the impact of the disability on the student's education, right? Getting a clear picture of where their current skills lie, so that we're explaining where the student is starting, where is their baseline, because that's going to help us then later look back and go, okay, how responsive was the student and what gains have we made looking at this IEP plan that has been developed? So the bottom line takeaway for the PLAAFP in my mind is that it has to be extremely descriptive, both specific and quantifiable, so that anyone can read it and identify, okay, these are the current strengths of the student, but these are the critical needs when I consider the general education classroom. And this is what needs to be done to support this student make gains within the school-based setting, right? So what do you include in the PLAFP? Everything. Evaluation results, assessment data, strengths, what works for the student, strategies that you know might work, what progress has been made if the student was on an IEP the previous year, were the goals met, if not, why, input from the teachers, from parents, from potentially even the student themselves. And then for later ages, it might be transition services, thinking about next steps after school. Right? But we really want to paint the picture in the PLAAFP of what is the adverse educational impact, right? And how is that impacting involvement as well as progress in the general education curriculum? So your data sources are going to be wide reaching, which ties back to this idea of a comprehensive assessment. right? We want to look at multiple data points, not just one measure, because we're not allowed to, but looking at our contextualized and decontextualized SLP measures. So that could be our norm reference tests, as well as our samples and behavioral observations. But we also want to look then at decontextualized and contextualized measures within the school-based setting, because that is going to help us very much capture what is the adverse educational impact within the general education curriculum. So that might be including state measures, local measures, looking at those work samples, conducting that artifact analysis, right? Interviews with the student, with parents, with teachers, right? Even looking at just performance from week to week in the classroom and having that open dialogue with teachers to know how the student is responding to instruction within the classroom setting, especially in areas related to potentially language and literacy, or even carryover for potentially articulation, right? So where does this take us, right? For a student, we need to basically capture where the student is now and come up with a statement that very clearly identifies critical needs, because that takes us to then our goals, right? What are the annual goals that we can achieve for this student reasonably within a 12-month period? So we want to, at this point, make sure that the IEP team, right, can create annual goals that document a direct relationship to present level of educational performance and are written in clear, measurable terms and are realistic to accomplish within 12 months, right? So the goals provide a mechanism for determining whether the student is making progress based on special education programming, or that SDI, specially designed instruction, right? The goals have to reflect an educational relevance, right? Which ties us right back to our comprehensive assessment, our present level of functioning, which leads us to the goals also have to be educationally relevant, right? Each goal should be clearly addressed in the present level of functioning to show that educational relevance. And it should also be a clear picture as to this is a critical need. So this is why it's been included as an annual goal. In your present level of functioning, you even want to include where that student is now, or that baseline starting point, so that a year later you can look back and go, okay, yes, we've made progress on this goal. So we've all sat through many SLP talks related to goal writing and SMART goals, right? So I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but I do want to target that our annual goals want to be specific, right? And one of the takeaways that I've always got from talking to special ed directors is don't lump goals together, right? I know that it saves a little bit of time, but our goals should target one skill only, and that one skill only has to be educationally relevant. Beyond being specific, we want to make sure that our goals are measurable and attainable, right? They have criteria, right? If there is no criteria, we can't measure them, so we can't report progress, right? And the criteria should be chosen on where the baseline or starting point is for that goal. It does not have to be 80% accuracy for all cases. It needs to be realistic for that student to make gains within the time period of the IEP, which I know I keep saying is 12 months, which we do have to do it in 12 months, but we all know in school-based settings, we're likely only getting 9 months of services within that 12-month window, right? One of the key takeaways that I think is important to keep in mind with annual goals is that it's going to be shared with the IEP team and developed as part of the IEP team, which includes parents as well as potentially students. So we want to make sure that all members of the IEP team can easily understand the language that we use in our goals. Okay. Now, one of the changes that occurred in IDA 2004 reauthorization is that short-term objectives are not mandated any longer. They do not have to be included within an IEP unless there is some change in testing accommodations. Then you do have to include short-term objectives if a child will be taking an alternative state assessment. I threw this in here though, because I think from an SLP mentality, we're very used to short-term objectives. And they're a good way to look at those annual goals and really come up with sort of that task analysis or hierarchy of how are we going to break that annual goal into more even semester by semester. I'm thinking academics, but my kids are in school 9 weeks, right? Like, what can we accomplish in each 9-week period to scaffold to that annual objective? Okay, and I'm still doing okay with time, so got just a little bit more to cover. So a large portion of the STA is very much focused on the IEP plan and a series of questions that relate directly back to what I've just talked about. So definitely take a look at that. So in full disclosure, I'm in the state of Pennsylvania. So I think one thing to consider about IDEA is it's the federal level. And each state and local education agency has to meet or exceed the federal mandates. So IDEA and the regulations attached to it at the federal level are shared with states, and states have to meet that or do better than that to receive federal education funding. So each state is going to have, at some point legislatively, some regulations related to IDEA. So for example, I've included what's common for PA up there, that if we're talking within this state, we're talking about chapter 14, or 22 PA code chapter 14. That's where all of special education services related to IDEA is covered. Right. I think the big takeaway here is each state is going to be different, right? So each state may adapt federal law differently, which is important to know then as a service provider, especially if you're providing services across different states, that those timelines might be different. What can be more challenging is sometimes localities may also add their own requirements or use their own vocabulary, right? One thing that is shared with all is that it cannot conflict with federal law, right? But it is not uncommon for states and localities to add additional requirements, right? So it could be creating specific procedures for eligibility of speech and language impairment. They can create their own timelines for creating evaluations or qualifications. In some cases, they might identify specific standardized tests. One thing that I've learned across my career is it's very important to identify whether the state that you're working in has state education agency control or it's at the local educational agency. So the example I usually share is I was a school-based SLP in Florida for a number of years, and Florida is an SEA state that at the state level, there's eligibility criteria as well as testing, or I should say comprehensive assessment guidelines that are shared with all districts across the state. I'm now in Pennsylvania, as I said, and we are an LEA state. So it is a district by district decision as to timelines, eligibility, as well as if there's actually guidelines related to eligibility. So that makes it a little bit more complex sometimes when you're in a state that it's a district by district or a local education agency by local education agency decision as to how they are going to adapt and implement federal law. So just to close us out, I want to share some final considerations, and this is sort of putting my SLP lens on, that what we do in an educational setting as a speech language pathologist is different than what we would do as a speech language pathologist in potentially a clinical outpatient type setting or a medical setting. That in those medical settings, we very much focus on more of a discrepancy model, right? And oftentimes our decisions are influenced by insurance coverage, right? And payments. And we can provide services probably more flexibly to students or children that might need speech or language support, right? Even our recommendations might be influenced by some outside drivers, right? Insurance or patient needs, okay? In an educational setting, we're quite different, right? That our services are part of FAPE, a free and appropriate education, which really means that we have to focus on that educational impact. And our decision-making for then services really needs to tie back to what is the educational impact and what do I recommend most for frequency of service or duration of service. And then it has to be balanced with those tenets of IDEA as to how do we balance services and maintain least restrictive environment, and understanding too that LRE is fluid, right? It's a continuum that sometimes it might be, I need to see a student one-on-one, sometimes it might be part of a group. And then all of that has to be captured within the IEP under that service delivery section. So making sure that we keep it broad enough, right, that we have that flexibility of and continuum of service delivery. And I think that sort of takes me to the end of my content, George. So again, I want to encourage everyone to definitely follow the link in the slides, as well as navigate to that website and pull the STA down, because it's a really nice 2-page tool that captures all of the content that I've talked about today.
Well, thank you so much, Erin. This was an incredible presentation. Personally speaking, as a parent with a child that has an IEP, this actually clarified a lot of things. My son, I don't want to disclose too much, but has specific learning disability. And I didn't realize how the related services applied to his plan. So you actually answered a lot of questions that I didn't know that I had, but actually helped me understand, because I go through this process every year, sit in the IEP meetings and some of these other things. And I actually didn't understand how all of this came together. But we have a handful of questions for you. We've only got a couple of minutes.
Okay.
So, the first question is, when you're evaluating students, what do you look for to determine whether online therapy qualifies as appropriate accommodation?
That's a great question that I'm actually going to throw to Ellen next week, because that's really what she's going to talk about, is comparable, right? And when is online, the same as potentially, and this was the best example I can get, like a pull-out treatment, because it's the same, right? Am I going to pull a child out and work with them one-on-one? And the question, I think, is more driven by, if I'm face-to-face or online, is that a comparable then service delivery model, right? And that then becomes almost a student-by-student question. Or I think our data can help us, honestly, George, too, is that looking at, is a student responding, and having that data to say, yes, right, this student is responding to this service delivery of, online treatment. That's your support then as to, is this an appropriate? I was teaching last night to some of the Pitt students, and I said that rarely do we get to the end of a comprehensive assessment and really have a full picture, right? That oftentimes we forge ahead in treatment and we're still collecting a lot of that assessment data. And that sort of is the case that this says, yeah, right? That I may not know until I try treatment, right? As to, is this appropriate for the student? I hope I answered that.
No,
Not too
that's awesome.
long-winded,
And I
yeah.
think it's a really great segue. There's a couple more questions here, but I think this is a great and appropriate segue. We have Ellen here with us. Ellen, if you don't mind unmuting yourself, this might give you a chance to, just give us a thumbnail sketch of what next week's webinar will be. And it looks like you're still muted there.
First, I thank you, George, for sponsoring this. And Erin, what an amazing presentation. Just, I learned a lot as well. So next week, we're going to talk about the basics of telepractice, what ASHA views as appropriate, and of course, stress that it needs to be consistent with federal law. And we're going to talk about the issue of what does it mean to have comparable services. I'm not sure that we have the answers to that. It probably depends on different school settings, different employment schemas. But we raise the question, is it, what do we mean by comparable? So that's what I think we'll be looking at next week. So
we do have a couple of more questions in queue. I don't know if we're going to be able to answer them in our allotted time. Maybe we can try one more,
Sure.
But Erin, if you want to punt, it might be more appropriate for next week's presentation. I don't know. But the question is, what is the biggest obstacle, or what are the biggest obstacles in taking specifically designed instruction online?
I think it's the same as in person. Honestly, I'm like, when we look at IDEA, it's taken us a long time to figure it out and how to implement face-to-face. So it's looking to see how can we shift a face-to-face interaction online. And I can think of some situations where online might be better for some students because you have more technology and more resources, right? And then in other cases, it may not be well matched to the student and their potential needs. But I think that goes back to the challenges inherent in what we do as speech language pathologists is it's all individualized, right? We won't know until we work with that student and look at their specific sets of needs. What are their strengths? What are the aids that they need? You know, what are the supports that they need? So I think it's very much a student by student type of decision. I'll pull from class last night too, that I said, you know, we like to diagnose and use our labels. So even like articulation impairment, right? For some students, online services might be excellent. And for others, they may not. If you know one student with an articulation impairment, you know one, right? I'm stealing that autism line, but I think it holds to everything that we do as professionals. And it has to be more of that looking, as Ellen said, at the whole context of the situation, as well as then focusing in on what are the needs of that particular student.
Well, that is an awesome answer. We have more questions, but we don't have time. Erin, we'd love to invite you to come back and participate as Ellen has today, if you so desire. But regardless, want to thank you for such a phenomenal presentation. That truly was very enlightening for me personally. I hope it was for the rest of our audience as well. So we express our deepest gratitude to you. Ellen, you're on deck. We're so excited to see what you have in store for us. To all of you, we want to welcome you back next week. Please join us Friday, November 5th at this same time, where Ellen Kahn will tackle part 2 of School Telepractice Assessment. Until then, I want to wish you all a great weekend and a happy and safe Halloween. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.